Parker, hey, thank you so much for being on the Be Love podcast today.
My pleasure. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to be here with you, and I'm excited for the workshop you're going to be offering for our Swedenborgian community in early May. And the topic of our conversation today is about love. I think I'm a minister, and in my community, our whole charge is to create communities of love, to create space where people can love each other. I am on a path of recognizing that there's lots of different ways to do that. And there's lots of challenges in the path of being loving community. And so this podcast is really about hearing people's stories about how love has moved them. I love the work you're doing right now. It's so resonant. I was just on your website for Eco Inclusive, and this vision of remembering that the natural world is an incredibly diverse place. And so we need to mirror that diversity in our communities, our organizations. I think I perceive that same thing to be true in churches. So anyway, there's my blurb. Where might you like to start when I ask that question of how love has called you, that we might be here today having this conversation? How far back do you want to go when I ask that question?
Go to the beginning. I was a little babe. But, I think that's not too far off. My first kind of experiences with love and community definitely came from my family. And growing up in a community that didn't have a whole lot of resources. And so a lot of ways that we cared for each other, right, was through that sharing of resources, and things that happen. There's a certain amount of protection, caring, empathy, building that happens in places where resources are slim. And I think that those were some of my first lessons in love and in caring and community, and having an understanding of this like communal way of living and being, right? Because as I feel like I've grown older, it's been harder to do. Like, I've had to intentionally create that, especially as I've grown older and had more resources. It's really interesting because I don't know, like, you've probably heard of Trevor Noah, right?
Sure.
And I was listening to him once talk about how capitalism has taken the village and sold it back to us. And so where you might have had people that if you needed childcare, there'd be someone that helped you. If you needed help cleaning or repairing something in your home, there'd be someone in the village that helped you. But we have separated ourselves because capitalism only really runs on this idea of individualism, and that we have to, it's everybody's job to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and ignore the man behind the curtain, which is the system, right? That it really impacts all of us. But if you're lucky enough to kind of make your way up a little, the way that you do that a lot of times is by separating yourself from community, from that village. And then when you have enough resources, then you pay someone to do those things. And so as I, got older, got into my career, I had to be very intentional about building community and making sure that I didn't lose that connection, with the people, not only the people that I care about the most, but also like the community around me. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I've been here for about 9 years. And so
Mhm.
it was one of my first goals when I got here to build like as much queer, people of color, marginalized identity, but also people with good hearts and caring souls community,
Yeah.
and I've been really lucky with that.
Yeah. Wow. I love you sharing that. And really resonates for me. I grew up in kind of a suburban white community, so immediately was planted in the isolated, no front porch, no asking for help, and I'm only just discovering or learning, and it's such a skill set that we just sort of lost
Yeah.
to ask for help, to reach out. So that's interesting that you were born with that knowingness. Did you notice that you lost it right away? Was it seamless?
I feel like there's different levels and definitions of success, right?
Mhm,
And it's interesting because we have, like, I don't know, a cultural consciousness around what does success mean in America today, and usually that's like money and resources and whatever, right? But I think if you actually ask people, because sometimes I do a lot of workshops, I do a lot of
mhm,
speaking, and I'll talk about what does success mean, what does it mean to make it, because I ask
mhm,
people to interrogate some of the underlying ideologies that we have in the US, things like everyone can make it if you work hard enough, right? You individual work and know-how and being willing to like put your nose to the grindstone, that is what makes you a success. And so then I ask people, first I ask, you know, do you believe that? And there are some people who are like, yeah, if you work hard, the opportunities out there for every American, right? And there's some people who are like, oh, like they haven't thought of it harder and they're like, maybe do we believe? And then the question becomes, well, how do you define success? Because people define it differently. And, maybe it's just family and blah, blah,
mhm,
blah. Because I'm like, there
mhm,
are people who are working 5 and 6 jobs, like working ton of jobs, ton of side hustles, and still aren't successful, right,
mhm.
here
Yeah,
in the US, but capitalism also relies on us not interrogating that,
yeah,
right? Because the individualism is the way the system works. If we were to look at statistics, if we were to look at who's represented, who's not, who has more wealth in the US, who does not, like all of these things, then we see that that is not even across the board, right? And there are a lot of systemic reasons why that is, but
mhm,
capitalism relies on us not thinking about those systemic reasons, not trying to get at the base of it. So if you can put it on the individual, right,
mhm,
for any form of marginalization, then we don't have to think about the system, right? And so thinking about what success is, I had this idea as a child, well, okay, I need to leave. Like success is me leaving this under-resourced community,
mhm,
right? And I realized right away that that put me in places where I felt very alone as a Black, non-binary, plus
mhm,
size, queer person, navigating these spaces that were supposed to make me successful, whether that was school or jobs or whatever. It required me to leave my community behind in order to achieve whatever level. And so I think I noticed the loneliness at first,
mhm,
I noticed that I had to be different. And I learned that very early on, which I think is
mhm,
one of the reasons I may have left my community when others didn't have the same opportunities because they
mhm,
weren't palatable enough, right?
mhm.
But I was born in the Bronx, but we moved to South
Okay.
Georgia when I was a kid going into high school because my dad had grown up there. And my parents who were like, Black Power atheists. My teenage rebellion was to join an all white Pentecostal church.
Okay.
Stick it to you.
We always have to rebel whichever direction it is. Yep.
And that rebellion led me into a really interesting space, and a space that I've spent many years, one, trying to heal
Mhm,
from, but
mhm,
also a space that taught me how Black people needed to show up in order to be
Mm,
palatable and acceptable for white people. So, I got told by certain church members that I was a good one, a good Black person, and that if other Black people could speak well or could act a certain way or whatever, they could be successful too. And
mm,
I had some internalized oppression for a good bit of
yeah.
my life because it made me look at my community different.
Mm,
And it made me think, "Oh, well, we're poor because they didn't say the right thing. They didn't dress the right way, right?" And I
mm,
realized getting into those professional spaces that I had to change. I had to code switch in my
yeah.
speech. I'd stop wearing head wraps. You see, I have a lot of locks right now, but when I first started my career, it was very clear in a lot of the places that I started working that it was in like dress code. You could not have locks, you could not have box braids, you could not have afros. The way
Mhm,
that Black hair naturally came out of its scalp was not considered professional. It was considered professional to straighten your hair, burn
mm,
it, with relaxer. And in order to really be as close and adjacent to whiteness and
yeah.
to not just whiteness, but, there's class, there's like all sorts of things just wrapped up in there. Yeah.
So you so that Pentecostal church actually gave you a doorway into those spaces? Was that kind of your on-ramping, you think?
I would say, like I think about like I have siblings and we have had very different life paths. Mm, I think because of some of those early lessons that I learned and they stayed a lot more connected and tethered to
Mhm,
community, which,
mm,
you know, I think it was good, good for them. Like,
yeah,
they didn't have to rebuild, reinvent, be
yeah,
something different in order to try and make a way, right?
yeah, yeah. Sounds I mean, from my tradition or from the Pentecostal tradition, the prodigal son, like, we gotta go away and then we gotta come back, and it
Yeah.
sounds like you went away from yourself a little bit, but then you came back.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was that like when you came back?
Well, I think I learned that love really allows people to show up as they are, It allows people to be true to themselves, and I think it's interesting what we consider as a society to be acceptable and not
Yeah,
acceptable, right? I'm sure a lot of folks have read Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist.
mm, yeah, yeah,
And it's interesting because he talks about like having not neutrality in like racism, but having like how do we think about culture? And a part of any system of oppression is saying that one way of being is better than another, and that because that way of being is better, you get to control how other people show up. And a lot of folks don't like understand that kind of ladder from bias to oppression.
yeah,
I often give a silly example. I say I like crunchy peanut butter. I like it. I prefer it over creamy peanut butter. So that's a personal bias, right? It
mhm,
doesn't impact anyone. It just is like what I prefer. And we all have biases. It's just the way, like our brain builds pattern mapping, builds preferences. We often, because we are so saturated in media and other things, our brain takes a lot of things in unconsciously and
mm,
files it away for later, so you might be in a dentist's office, listening for your name to be called consciously, playing on your
mhm,
phone consciously and unconsciously. Your brain is listening to the conversation across from you. It's listening to the television playing behind you. A commercial about hemorrhoids comes on, and you're not paying attention, but your brain goes, "Oh, here's our folder
mm,
about that. We're putting this information in here, closing it up, and we'll use it later." And
Mhm.
then later on, when you hear that word, maybe someone, your friend confides in you, like,
Mhm.
I've got hemorrhoids. Your brain
I know
says,
something about that. Yeah.
right? Your brain says, here's all the information we have
Mhm.
on that topic. Even
Mhm.
if you've never looked it up, even if you've never had it yourself, you have an opinion, right? And we do that with people as well. Like we get a lot of input about people and places and things, and our brain stores it away. And then you meet someone, and your brain might tell you safe, not safe. This is what it means to be that type of person, what it means to be this type of person, right? And it's stereotypes and pulling from bias. So we all have bias. It's in the way that we choose to utilize it or not, right? So if I like crunchy peanut butter over creamy peanut butter, but I learned, like, you invite me out to lunch, and I know that you are a creamy peanut butter eater. I
Mhm.
might have an instinctive reaction that I'm not even examining that tells me
Mhm.
to say no. And if I examined it, I might realize that, oh, I have a prejudice
Mhm.
tied to my bias. I
Mhm.
think that creamy peanut butter people don't make the best life decisions. And I don't think that you're going to choose a good place for us to eat lunch, right?
Mhm.
So my bias is causing a prejudice that's affecting the way that I interact with people who
Mhm.
have a different preference, right? Let's say I take it a step further and I decide, actually, this is like bigger. Like I've got a fundamental difference with
Mhm.
creamy peanut butter eaters. I think that not only do they not make the best life decisions, but like there's something like really wrong with that way of life. And so I am telling my children they can't play with creamy peanut butter eaters. I am looking for a home and I asked my realtor to help me find a predominantly crunchy peanut butter eating neighborhood because I just want to be in a neighborhood with people that share my values.
Mhm.
I own a business, and I put a sign on the board that on my door that says "No creamies allowed"
Mhm.
because I'm a private business owner and I have the right to serve whoever I want to serve. Right
Mhm.
at this level, I am now using my scope of power
Mhm.
to discriminate against
Mhm.
creamy peanut butter eaters, right? So it's gone from bias to a prejudice to actual discrimination. Limiting opportunities within my scope of people with that eat creamy peanut butter, maybe that like, or if I was a teacher, like I feel differently about my kids who have families that are creamy peanut butter eaters, so on and
Yeah.
so forth. All of those things, right? Anyone can do to one another.
Mhm.
However, let's say that I decide um, that no one should be eating creamy peanut butter. Like, this is just a better way of life. So
Mhm.
I get, enough signatures to have a measure put on the next ballot that says that creamy peanut butter is going to be illegal in the state of Colorado and it gets enough votes. There's enough either secret or outright crunchy peanut butter eaters that vote yes to
Mhm.
this that
Mhm.
now creamy peanut butter is outlawed in the state of Colorado. And it doesn't matter. Like if you come in and you have creamy peanut butter, you can be arrested, you can pay a fine, right? So now it's outlawed. And two generations down the road, right, it seems normal. People who are crunchy peanut butter eaters and that's their preference, that's their bias, are like, this is the way to be because other people, like obviously the law backs me up, these
Mhm.
things back me up. So obviously, this is how you're supposed to be. And people who are doing differently are wrong, right? And so when we think about we think about the fact that gay marriage was illegal, right? Or we think about like women not being able to vote or black people being property. Slavery was legal and black people escaping from slavery was illegal. So not everything that is
Mhm.
legal is like the right thing. And a lot of our laws and things are based off of kind of biases and preferences to run our like communities. And I think that it's interesting the way that we wanna change people.
Mhm.
We have this need to kinda control how folks show up in spaces and not there's so much, like, tied to that,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
Someone being trans genuinely does not impact someone else who does not wanna be trans, you know? And, where there's so many laws coming out
Mhm.
about trans identities, about their ability to do the things that they want with their
Mhm.
own body, which is so ridiculous to me because regret rates for surgeries for trans people at the high end are like 3%,
Right.
but regret rates for people doing plastic surgery,
Mhm.
right? Which they don't have to go see a doctor for, they don't have to go through all of these things for that trans people have to do to make sure that it's okay for
Mhm.
them to get that, like, surgery,
Mhm.
right? Um even though that regret rate for trans people is so low, people who are just doing that on their own is like 13%, 15%, right?
Mhm.
So it's between 0.3 to 3% for trans people regret rate, 7 to 15% for people who are just
Yeah.
getting gender affirming care or body
Mhm.
affirming care, you know, and but we still say that we have the right to say what trans people are doing to their bodies,
Mhm.
but it's okay if someone wants to, like, get a nose job or,
Yeah.
and they're
Mhm.
not trans. So, yeah, when I think about love, I think about acceptance. I think about building
Okay.
communities
Yeah.
where people are allowed to be themselves and not have to change to have entry into those communities, which is what I had to do, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. What so many people have had to do and what has been done for many, many, many generations. It does feel like this is a generation of reckoning of just what you just did, kind of tracing this back. Why do we have this assumption that crunchy peanut butter eaters are better? Where does this come from? And then as we investigate, we see, oh, wait, this was because some dominant population had an idea that this is how it was supposed to be. And I guess that's just very threatening to a portion of the population to do that work. And I like that you're naming like it is just something humans do. Why do we do it? It doesn't make any sense, but we're coming to realize that this is what we do. Somehow we feel more comfortable if other people are mirroring our preferences.
Yeah.
Um, and you also mentioned like finding a community where we have shared values. And how do you wrestle with that human proclivity of finding a space that feels comfortable or home while being so deeply committed to creating diverse community? Do you feel like something happens where you can like you named in Denver that you're finding like queer people and people of color, and I often find like I feel jealous as a straight white woman. I was queer at one time. Now I'm a straight white woman. I'm kind of boring, and it does feel like people on the margins can sometimes find that community almost more easily together. Like something's got to break open in us. I think maybe to be able to start to feel like we have differences and a shared sense of value.
Yeah.
Where does that show up for you?
So first of all, and not
Yeah.
not to challenge, but,
Okay. Good. Please do. Please do.
I just thought it was interesting, that you said that you were queer, but now you're straight.
Right.
'Cause like, so I am married, to a cisgender man.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess people could make the argument that as a non-binary person, like it's a
Yeah.
it's a queer relationship, but,
Yeah.
not really.
Yeah.
But I'm pansexual. We're poly,
Yeah.
so I do have a girlfriend, so I guess it's kind of easy to see, but even if we weren't poly,
Yeah.
even if I, was we were monogamous, I
Yeah.
would still be queer, that's
Sure.
still a part of, my identity, and it's not defined by the relationship
Sure.
that I'm
Sure.
in, or even if those.
Well, I'll take that back then. I'm
Yeah.
happy to keep my queerness. I am
I
also married to a cisgender man, but
Even if it changes over time,
yeah.
I think that, but I just thought it was interesting, that you said
Mhm.
that because that is how our society labels things and how we are taught to look at and hold on to things. And I
Mm.
think one of the reasons that, like, even like people, It's interesting. I think a lot of the pushback around trans identities and around queerness is related not only to homophobia, but also patriarchy and sexism. And it is very threatening to the way that we've set up what masculinity is, right? It's threatening to have someone who is like, that's not what I want. I'm, because the conversation, when we talk about like bathrooms, people are talking about trans women. They're not talking about trans men. They're not talking about bearded beefcake trans men who are
Yeah.
now supposed to be going in to women's bathrooms because it's what's on their birth certificate and it's against the law. Like, we're not talking about that because we have such a narrow thing. When we talk about sexuality, it's very narrow. You're this or you're that, and you can't claim this if you are doing that, right? And we, because we try to make things very black and white, right? We lose that amazing spectrum that makes up the
Mhm.
beauty of humanity. And we also shame people and say that, you can't be this or you can't claim that, or, you know, like, for a long time, we hid our queerness. My partner's bisexual, has a boyfriend. We hid
Right.
our queerness
Mhm.
because it was better and safer to be a heterosexual presenting relationship and couple, right? So, like, when I talk about celebrating differences, when I talk to organizations and people, I talk about how we are taught to coalesce around similarities. And I think that a bit of that is tribal, a bit of that is, for a long time, humans were defined by our ethnic groups. And
Yeah.
sometimes people don't know the difference between ethnicity and race. But
Mhm.
before we had racial categories, which were relatively recently, we had
Mhm.
ethnic groups, and your ethnic groups weren't defined exactly by the way that you look. Yes, people in certain ethnic groups tended to look similar because we didn't have plane, trains, and automobiles, and there wasn't a whole lot of traveling and mixing, but there
Mhm.
was some. And if
Mhm.
someone came into another region, another ethnicity, and decided, this is where I'm staying, they got absorbed into that culture. And that
Mhm.
ethnicity was defined by the food that you ate, the clothing that you wore, sometimes religion, cultural
Mhm.
traditions, all of these things made these different ethnic groups. And so then, like, relatively recently, scientists like Carl Linnaeus, who was going around labeling everything, said, "Oh, if we're labeling animal species, like, now we need to label humans because humans are different, but we're not, right? We were not different species." But he was like, "We're going to label humans and we're going to group them based on outside characteristics. So, not like cultural characteristics, but by the way people look." And it came from the beginning with morality attached to it because, what they said, white, black, yellow, and red, four ethnic categories. And, what he said was, first of all, they said that white people were industrious and smart, black people were lazy and ruled by caprice. Also, the people who are considered racially white today, a lot of them were not considered racially
Right.
white even
Mhm.
100 years ago. The conversations when we were creating the Immigration Act in the 1920s wasn't about people from our southern borders. It was about white people from the wrong parts of Europe. So if you
Right.
were from southern or eastern Europe, as opposed to Western and Northern Europe, you were not considered white,
Right.
right? And they made arguments, or like Irish people, there were graphs that they made. I saw this one that was a white Anglo-Saxon man, an Irish man, and a black man in profile. And it had
Mhm.
like all of these. First of all, it was a picture. So I think it's
Mhm.
really funny because the picture also had a bunch of measurements. They measured their own picture to
Mhm.
say that this Irish man's features are more in line with Negro features than with white features. So, see, they are not white, right?
Mhm.
And I hear stories from my friends about how their families had to assimilate into whiteness. They changed their last names. They didn't send their kids to school with their ethnic foods for fear of them getting teased. They
Yeah.
didn't teach their kids their ethnic language, just learn English, all of these things. So, this country that was supposed to be a melting pot, and we tout this, right?
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
we're a melting pot, right?
Mhm.
We meant to melt people down into one thing because we had a unique problem because all around the world, these different places that were founded way before the US,
Mhm.
right? They had their ethnic cohesive flavor. But here in the US, we had lots of different things coming together and
Mhm.
we acted like it was this big, like, oh, we're welcoming all these people. But really, what it was is how do we distill these people down as close to whiteness and what we have defined as whiteness as possible? And how do we then, you're either in this or you are othered and you're not good enough to be in this, right? And so for years, it's been how do we find success by being similar? I tell my people that I talk to that you are really good at celebrating the things that make you the same, but have you put as much effort and practice into celebrating the things that make you different? People say celebrate diversity, but they haven't built the skills for
Yeah.
doing that. They don't have the love, the empathy, the ability to think about how someone else is experiencing the world, and
Mhm.
that's at the forefront of the way that I love. Like I think about like my experience is not the only one.
Mhm.
It's just mine. And someone else, they might be showing up a certain way because they've had a different experience that has impacted them in ways that bring them differently into the space. And that's
Mhm.
okay. Like I can, learn. I can
Mhm.
see what their needs are.
Mhm.
Sometimes that like celebration of what their needs are,
Mhm.
allows me to be in close proximity with them.
Mhm.
Sometimes not, because maybe things don't mesh, but I can still be in community with them, right? I
Yeah.
can still have that empathy. I can still talk to someone who has a different viewpoint than
Mhm.
me. And I
Mhm.
find like I bring that to my work as well as, I do a lot of consulting
Mhm.
around environmental justice and diversity, equity, inclusion in the conservation space. And I understand when I say things, when I go to a meeting and folks are like, why are we doing DEI in nature? What are you trying to say? Are the trees racist? Right? It's like how I'm like, okay, they don't understand my experience
Mhm.
and the experience of other people that might maybe look like me in these spaces. How can
Mhm.
we connect with them? I have a lot of empathy for white cis straight men right now.
Mhm.
And I don't say that in a lot of places. I just did a video
Sure.
talking about it on my
Mhm.
social media. And it's something I've been thinking about for a while, but haven't really put into words because that's a
That's an edge.
messy,
Yeah.
messy, controversial statement. But
Yeah.
what I why I say that is because I have empathy for white cisgender straight men. I hate patriarchy. I hate
Mhm.
white supremacy. I hate homophobia,
Mhm.
right? But there's a person
Mhm.
outside of those systems. And what I see white men grab, and I'm not a white man, but so through
Mhm.
my
Thank you.
observation,
Mhm.
what I observe, maybe some white men are struggling
Mhm.
with is finding a home
Yeah.
outside of white supremacy, patriarchy,
Yeah.
homophobia, sexism.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people with marginalized identities, whether it's women or people of color or people with disabilities, have had to like figure out a place for healing outside of white supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia, whatever it is. And
Mhm.
often that they're able to find groups to find that healing, to find that community. But I don't see as many of those groups for white men, right?
Mm.
And if we are telling white men that you need to leave patriarchy and white supremacy behind, there's a different way to show up that isn't about domination, isn't about, taking or war or whatever, and isn't about individualism, isn't about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. There's a different way of being, but what is directing them to that? What is the space for them to go when a white man starts to wake up and says, "No,
Yeah.
I don't want this." Like,
Mhm, mhm.
how, because when we look at other spaces that are like, "No, this is great, and you should be proud of it, and you can have a space over here. There's a space for you in the manosphere. There's a space for you in this
Mhm,
white supremacy
mhm,
brother organization. There's a space for
mhm.
you where you don't have to interrogate the bigger oppression, and you
Right.
can just be accepted and loved for those very traits that
Yeah.
of white supremacy, domination, patriarchy. Then
Mhm,
why would they want to, if there's not a space for them? Like,
mhm.
why would they? And when I talk about diversity, white men are included in that. If you
Right.
put me in a space, a room full of non-binary, queer, femmes, black
Mhm.
femmes, it would not be a diverse room. Like, we've been
Right.
having conversations about, oh, that's diversity. One person can't be diversity.
Right.
If you put me in a room with a bunch of other people like me, that's not diversity, but you add a cisgender straight white man, suddenly we have diversity.
Mhm.
And the conversation, I think they haven't seen themselves in that conversation because it's hard for them when your whole identity has been told to you that white supremacy is your identity. It's hard to separate yourself from that. And also because there's been such shifts in
Yeah.
language. Like when we talk about white supremacy, people think torches and crosses burning on someone's front lawn.
Mhm,
But they
mhm.
don't think about the fact that when I was a kid, there was a flesh colored crayon in my crayon box and it was not the color of my flesh.
Right.
Or even today when I buy nude pantyhose, I just look ashy. Like it's not because it's not my skin color nude, right? Those
Mhm.
things are say who the default is. When you
Yeah.
can walk into a room and say, "Hey, you guys," and it's meant as a welcoming for all the mixed gender people in the room. But if you walk into the room and you say, "Hey, you gals,"
Mhm,
and some people would get mad because it's
mhm.
not thought of as the same, right?
Yeah.
We can see the supremacy and who is defaulted to, who is thought of as the template that everyone else has to compare themselves
Yeah.
against. And it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that white men have it easy because they have other identities.
Mhm,
They could be like have socioeconomic issues,
mhm,
could be queer, could be trans, could be like all of these other things. They can have intersecting identities that make things harder for them. And what's difficult is that's easy to see. So if you say, you might have privilege in this area. People are
mhm.
like, "Oh, no, I grew up poor.
Right.
I don't have that
Right.
privilege," because they're naming that it's very easy to see the spaces where the system doesn't work for you and harder to see when you're just living your life because the system has been built with you in mind,
Right.
right?
Yeah. You don't even notice
You
that
don't even
still.
notice. Like I get up in the morning, if I'm going to go shopping for clothing, I
Mhm.
know that the clothing store is not going to be built for my body size as a plus size person, that I might find something, but more than likely, I'm either going to have to compromise or they're going to tell me to go and shop online, right? I don't have slim body privilege.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I know that going into the store, but what I don't think about is the fact that I don't have to call ahead to find out is the store street level or is it boutique? So there's 2 steps
Mhm.
down, getting in.
Mhm.
Now I can't get my mobility device there. Are the aisles too small for a wheelchair to get through? I don't think
Mhm.
about that because I am an able-bodied person living
Mhm.
in a world that has been designed and built by able-bodied people.
Yeah.
So I don't think about my like able-bodied privilege or
Mhm.
the ways that there is ableism rampant. Like, I have to consciously think about that, but I sure do think about, "Well, when I get in this store, they're probably gonna tell me I gotta buy my size online."
Yeah,
Like,
right.
because we know the ways that the system is not
Mhm.
built for us,
Mhm.
but we're not so keen on the way that the system,
Yeah.
has been
Because
built with us in mind.
right, right, it takes effort to put your mind in that space.
Yeah.
I love the way you spoke about cis men and white men and that if we can take these systems of oppression and put them over here and realize they're affecting all of us, that we can start to see each other's humanity and help each other through this process of dismantling these oppressive systems and that's hard work. It takes consciousness and awareness. What can you tell us anything about your journey of coming into this awareness? Were there people, schools, books, mentors, friends?
Well, like I said, a lot of it was from my own experiences in a world that wasn't designed with me in mind.
Yeah.
And then having an understanding of, like, what would it, like, look like? I know y'all have had, like, whoever's listening to this has had the all aboard ADHD train version of, my thought process. Like, I know I mentioned Ibram X. Kendi, but I think I didn't mention where I didn't get to where I was going, which was he talks about the ways that we think one race is better than the other.
Yeah.
But what about race neutrality, cultural neutrality?
Mhm. Mhm.
And that made me think. That really made me like, I had been deconstructing, like, an understanding of, like, blackness isn't bad, and because someone didn't pull their pants up is not the reason they weren't successful. And, like, speaking, like, code switching, like, people can understand me if I don't code switch, but,
Mhm. Mhm.
and, like, why is it? Like, I had that understanding,
Mhm.
but it was an extra step, in reading that book, oh, so many years ago, where he talks about why is it that we think, pants sagging is worse than, like this? Why is it that things that are culturally Black are thought of as ghetto and whatever until,
Mhm.
someone of another race takes that on and then it's like, fashionable and now it's a new fad and whatever,
Mhm.
right? Like,
Mhm.
rap used to be the worst of the worst
Right.
music according to American culture and making kids kill people and blah blah blah. And then
Mhm.
it, like, when it became like adopted by white audiences, then it became like edgy and cool, and we think of certain ways. We have said that the way that, and I say, like, white culture, it's an interesting thing. Like, there was like I saw the other day when they were interviewing this guy who is really deeply a white supremacist, and there's so many videos of him talking about the superiority of the white race, and they're trying now in the current administration, they're trying to get him approved to a position, and they asked him, so, in the past, you've talked about the need to protect white culture and what is white culture. And he
Mhm.
couldn't really say it. I feel like one of them was something that was related to Irish culture, ethnic culture.
Mhm.
There's no such thing
There
as
isn't.
white culture. We have different ethnicities, and people have been made to get, like, white culture, which, like, I hope that if you are white and you're listening to this, that you think about, like, what is like, what does it mean to be whiteness, right? Because you have an ethnic identity. A
Mhm.
bunch of white culture has been separating people with a certain skin tone from their ethnic identity and then
Mhm.
making a mishmash of things and separating people from a culture that then makes them feel the need to search back for that belonging. to search back for traditions, to search back, and oftentimes that is taken from ethnicities and cultures that were not afforded the ability to transition into whiteness because they didn't have the same skin tone. So they held on to a lot of those cultures and
Mhm.
tradition. And now whiteness is, how do we synthesize that into something palatable for people who have had to leave behind their ethnic culture?
Yeah.
And, I feel like that's really sad. And also, why do we say that this bland way of being is better than, like, other things, whether other
Mhm.
ways that people show up? But that's
Mhm.
a huge part of the
Yeah.
way that we keep cultures and ethnicities
Yeah.
in the United States. And it's a huge part of telling people, like, oh, your culture is under attack.
Mm.
What culture
What is
is
that?
that?
What is the
And when we talk about whiteness, like, the reason why race is such an arbitrary thing is that if you were, like, ethnic groups have, like, kind of like, these are our traditions, this is our language. But racially, if you were to line up 1,000 people from
Mhm.
darkest to lightest, you would have some people who are racially black down on the lighter side, some people who are racially white down on the darker side.
Mhm.
If you were to do the same hair texture, kinkiest to straightest, you would have that same mix because there
Yeah.
isn't one defining feature of whiteness, of blackness, of what there's not a defining physical feature,
Yeah.
right? But we are trying, we're like, this is this, and then we have a cultural commitment to upholding these structures, even to the detriment
Yeah.
of people. And I find that people who are racially categorized as white, they find very quickly that when you step out of white supremacy, the protections and the acceptance that is afforded to you
Yeah.
by ignoring the system
Mhm.
quickly goes away. You're not
Mhm.
considered a good white person. We saw in Minnesota with
Yeah.
those 2 shootings,
Mhm.
right? Because they dared to be a white person standing in protection and
Mhm.
protesting about treatment of brown people. They lost that protection so quickly,
Mhm.
because it's about the system. It's not about individual people. Like, if you act outside of that system as a white person, as a man, right? Patriarchy is a cage for men.
Yeah.
Like, you're not
Mhm.
supposed to cry, you're not supposed to
Mhm.
show up in like a certain way, your masculinity gets questioned the minute you step out of this, like, narrow definition of what
Mhm.
masculinity is.
Yeah.
Then suddenly you're not doing man right, and we're going to question, we're going to call you gay, and we're going to say, that all of these bad, you don't have that protection any
Yeah.
longer. And it's the
Mhm.
same with, like, all of these, like, systems. And so I think when people start to wake up to the
Yeah.
fact, right, when I started to wake up to the fact that, wait a second, like, my trying to be as white as possible isn't getting me anything. And I didn't
Mhm.
consciously think about it. Like, I didn't say, I'm trying to be a white person. I just said,
Mhm.
I'm going to talk this way. I'm going to
Mhm.
act this
Mhm.
way. I'm going to suppress my natural
Mhm.
things that I want to say. I'm not going to wear head wraps. I'm going to
Mhm.
straighten my hair,
Mhm.
all of these things. But still, I was on the outside because it's not as easy for me as a Black person to say I'm gonna change my name or change my speech or the food that I'm eating. There's still a physical marker. So I'm
Mhm.
always still on the outside. As much as people want to say that they're accepting people, if someone has to change to be acceptable in your eyes, then you're not really loving them. You're not really accepting them if they have to be someone different, right? And
Mhm.
so, yeah, and so then we put morality to it, right? Like, the argument against trans people, like, people might have thought it was weird, or like, I don't like it, or I'm not gonna do that, or might have talked whatever, but the laws are
Yeah.
being fueled by fear and othering. It's
Yeah.
being fueled by saying that trans people are out to hurt you, sexually
Mhm.
assault you in bathrooms, corrupt your children. Then suddenly, once we put morality to it,
Mhm.
then we can really oppress this
Yeah.
group. Suddenly, when we say creamy peanut butter people are just like bad people that don't make the best life decisions,
Yeah.
now we can create a system of oppression, right?
Mhm.
And you will go right along with it because you feel like you're protecting yourself,
Yeah.
but you're not. And the system is also keeping you down, right?
Mhm.
The system is
Mhm.
also oppressing you just to a lesser degree. So you feel like you're good.
I mean, just listening, there's just so much violence. There's
Yeah.
just so much violence on all, and when thinking of think as a white woman, just yes, maybe there has been privilege to it, but there's so much anonymity and there's so much conformity that's required. It's I don't get to be if I'm gonna just sit behind that label, I don't get to be the full expression of myself. I mean, I certainly feel like that's the heart of for me, like the new world I long for is where we all can really feel love and we need to be ourselves to feel love. And this is a we're at a new moment of consciousness. I mean, there's more people because of your work and so many others' work. People are waking up. People are starting to see the ways they have been complicit in not living their own lives, even, but living by
Yeah.
these arbitrary expectations. And even in this moment of challenge, it feels like they're not actually creating. Like you asked the question of success at first, like what's success? And I'd say even those who are have the cars and the house. They're lonely, they're not well, they're isolated from community, so
Because you got to protect yourself. Once you get that success,
so it's almost like nobody's really succeeding under these systems anymore, which maybe is a hopeful sign. We've been going at this for a little while, and the one thing we did not talk about yet was the natural world, the ecological world, which I know is so embedded in all
yeah.
of your work, which I just think is brilliant. I think the natural world is. I mean, we're all nature, right? We have been talking about
Yes.
the natural world because we're all a part of nature, and the parts untouched by these human brains of ours are particularly magical and have so much to teach us. What might you want to share about the interweaving of your love for like where did that start? Where did that begin?
Well, I grew up in the Bronx.
Yeah, okay, so not there.
But there, like
There, okay,
that
good,
is
good, tell
that
me.
is the, like, assumption, not there,
Yeah.
because we think of nature, right? We don't think of cities as nature. We think of nature as something separate from ourselves.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that way of thinking of nature and wilderness is actually pretty recent. Like John Mayer, who some people might know, was like a prolific nature writer. John Mayer and Teddy Roosevelt went to like Yosemite, and like people talk about like the birthplace of America's best idea. Thanks, Ken
Mhm.
Burns. Um, and like indigenous people felt and thought like they were one with nature. And a lot of indigenous people, wherever they are in the world, feel that. Like,
Yeah.
we are not separate from nature. We are a part of nature. Nature is us. Our plants, our animals, we're siblings.
Mhm.
This is a part of the ecosystem that keeps us going. And so, like in Yosemite, people the indigenous people walking through would drop seeds, they would tend things. They were like a keystone species. Play would come
Mhm.
back through, there'd be plants, but they weren't the only ones eating the plants, the fruits, the stuff that they planted. They understood the give and take of being one with nature. But
Mhm.
John Muir, he wrote Teddy Roosevelt talking about um, how ranchers and other people were destroying the wilderness because they were cutting down trees and destroying these developers destroying the wilderness for their own use and for money. And so
Mhm.
Roosevelt went out, and had a chat with him, even though his Roosevelt's advisors told him that the American wilderness is so vast, it could never be depleted. And so
Mm.
that's how they were thinking about it in 1903. But he went and he was like, actually, I think there's something that needs to be done. John Muir wrote and gave us this idea. He was one of the ones that gave us this idea of wilderness as being separate from us. And a lot of his writings were used to kind of create like what we think of as public lands today. Like we have to remove man from nature. That's wilderness. We're not nature, we're separated. That's wilderness out there. And the best way to care for wilderness is to limit man's use and ability to utilize it. Now, as we got bigger and as capitalism got bigger, yes, but like, you
If we're
know,
gonna do it that way, then yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
but maybe we wouldn't be in this place if we hadn't separated ourselves from nature. So we think of
Mm,
urban environments as like not being nature, but it is. It's just nature that we changed,
mm,
right? We put concrete over it. We diverted rivers. We did these things. And because of those changes, people don't think of cities as nature, and then we don't watch as much as how the pollution and things in cities are
mm,
affecting nature out there, because there
mhm,
aren't walls, there aren't boundaries around the city. Like it's
mhm,
all one ecosystem, right?
mhm,
So I was
mhm,
growing up in the Bronx, and we talk a lot about today about how we value environmental actions that are done out of altruism more than we do those done out of need. And
mm,
so when I was a kid in the Bronx, me and my dad would collect aluminum cans
mhm,
because back in the day you could get 5 cents a can.
mhm.
And no one told me that I was recycling or that I was, like, cleaning
Right.
things up, like, because it wasn't thought of that way.
Mhm,
My uncle who used to ride his bike, like, 30 miles round trip to work, no one told him he was a long distance biker, he was l lowering
right,
carbon emissions, right?
right.
But yet we have, like, a ride your bike to work day one
Mhm,
day a year or whatever in
mhm.
Boulder, and there are people out clapping and handing out drinks and breakfast burritos. Right, so I would collect cans, and that's where I got my sense of place, because
Mhm,
I noticed that we were leaving a lot of garbage behind as we got the cans. I also noticed that in other neighborhoods, we'd have to dig through the trash to
yeah,
get to the cans, but they were, like, just on the ground in my neighborhood, and those other neighborhoods that were more wealthier were cleaner, nicer, right?
mhm,
And so I started bugging my parents. I was like, "Why? Why is it so
mhm,
dirty? What do we do about this?"
mhm,
I don't know if my mom was, like, trying to encourage me to, like, my first bit of activism, or was trying to get me off her back, because she said, "I don't know, why don't you write a letter to the New York Times?" So I did. I, like, typed up several letters on my dad's computer. I have a copy of
mhm,
one, and I was really passionate. I had never
mhm,
had an environmental education course. I'd never like, I didn't even know that this career existed until
mhm,
I was, like, out of my bachelor's degree in college,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
But I wrote this letter, and it was like, "Dear people, we're polluting our earth. We're throwing trash in the ocean, beaches, and more." It was
mhm,
very dramatic. And it was just from my observations.
mhm,
And it's so funny because I wrote that letter when I was 9. We moved to Georgia. I did, like, projects when I had science projects in school. I did things, like, around recycling and other things.
mhm, mhm,
But I didn't know this was a pathway
mhm,
available to me, even though I cared about the planet and I cared
mhm,
about nature.
mhm.
You know, because there weren't people in my neighborhood teaching those things,
Yeah,
you know, and there's a long history as to why we don't have as much representation within conservation and, you know, other fields. We have more representation in environmental justice
yeah,
because they're the people that are most impacted. So many studies have shown, and a lot of people don't know this, that race is the biggest predictive factor for if you're located next to an environmental harm. It's even
yeah.
bigger than socioeconomic status, which I would have
Mm.
thought would have been
Mhm,
the biggest thing, right? But from the beginning, like back to Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, they felt like they were building a movement for white people, you know,
yeah,
like Roosevelt, said he argued that American democracy was a product of the Anglo-Saxon race, and that it was the responsibility of white Americans to ensure that democracy, the land conservation was always maintained. right?
Mhm.
Um, People like Madison Grant, who a lot of folks don't know about today,
Mhm.
but Thomas C. Leonard wrote that Grant was a co-founder of the American environmental movement. He was
Mhm.
a crusading conservationist. He preserved like California redwoods, saved American bison from extinction, fought for stricter gun control laws. He was one of the ones that helped create Glacier and Denali National Park. He wrote this book called The Passing of the Great Race. And in it, he talks about the need to save the white race, well, Anglo-Saxon, because he was
Mhm.
one of the ones that they used some of his writings to think about the changing stock of American immigration,
Mhm.
characterized by the increasing numbers of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Mhm.
He compared in his book the saving of the redwoods because he was one of the founders of the Save the Redwood League. He said
Mhm.
the redwoods were a superior tree, and he compared the saving of the redwoods to the saving of the white race. His book was full of racism, eugenics. He was one of the scientists that invented elaborate systems for classifying people based on their real or perceived disabilities.
Mhm.
He said that certain racial groups were superior to others. He, said that we needed to have people sterilized. Teddy Roosevelt
All the good stuff.
loved his book. The other
Mhm.
person, another person that loved his book, Adolf Hitler. Adolf
Mhm.
Hitler said that it was he called it one of his Bibles because a lot of times people don't understand or realize that what was
Mhm.
done by the Nazi party in Germany got its legs from
Mhm.
what was already happening in the United States. And if you view
Yeah.
some of the transcripts from
Mhm.
those early meetings in the Nazi
Mhm.
party, they literally were like, they're doing it great. Like, they used to have people enslaved. Now, like, people can't they have them segregated. They have these tests for people being able to vote. They, are like, they have all of these laws. Like, we need to do what the US is doing. We've lost that conversation, because the US is considered a hero of
Yeah.
that story,
Yeah.
and we don't tell the part where all of like of the blueprint was written by the US. And
Mhm.
this is literally a fact, like people can look it up. And so
Mhm.
I think about not having that entry. Like, my dad was born in 1950 during the Jim Crow era in
Mhm.
Georgia. During that time, park superintendents would get money to build separate but equal facilities. But then they would say, "Oh, we need to see like if Black people even want to be in these spaces." But Black
Mhm.
people weren't going to show up to spaces, especially in the South, where
Mhm.
they knew it was only built for white people, because that was a good way to get, beat up or killed.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
then they would use that as evidence that Black
Mhm.
people didn't want to be in those spaces, and they would divert the money to the other parts of the park. And so my dad, growing up in Georgia, never went to a park. I didn't
Mhm.
go to my first national park till I was well into my 20s. My dad didn't take me. My parents didn't take me. My parents didn't teach me how to swim,
Yeah.
not because Black people don't swim, but
Yeah.
because pools were segregated and there
Mhm.
wasn't a Black pool for my parents to learn that,
Mhm.
And so there's a history as to why people aren't in these environmental outdoor recreation spaces. And it's not that the trees are racist,
Right.
but people don't understand. And
Mhm.
still today, I go out, people ask me, they always assume that I don't know where I'm going. Am I lost on the trail? Do I have the right supplies? Is it my first time hiking?
Mhm.
Like, I've been camping and had like people blaring country music at another campsite,
Mhm.
right? But our campsite was told to turn down our music. And when asked why, it was, well, their music is more acceptable to the general people, and people have complained about your music, right? Like, there's just all of these things, these kind of double standards that people don't see. And then if you do talk about microaggressions or things that happen in these spaces, people are like, "Well, that's not like, that could happen to anyone. That's not about race. That's not about this."
Mhm.
Without the understanding that, yeah, it maybe could happen to anyone, but it
Mhm.
happens statistically more to
Yeah.
people in these other identity
Yeah.
categories, you know?
Mhm. Yeah.
So we have to have empathy for one another, and we have to think about, like, when race is the biggest predictive factor for if you're located next to an environmental harm, there's
Mhm.
something wrong there, and you might feel like, "Oh, well, it's okay, like, not in my backyard," right?
Mhm.
There's a lot of NIMBYism, but that I don't know, like I said, there aren't walls on the, like, side
Mhm.
of the city. When people say, "Not in my backyard," they don't realize that they are setting themselves on a road for their own destruction, you know? I used to
Yeah.
teach pond study courses, have you heard of pond study?
Mm-mm.
Like, so we take little kids out
Okay.
and they would scoop up water and do water quality testing, right? And one of the things we would test the water based off of not only water quality, but we would look at what animals were in the water. Because if it
Mhm.
was like, certain species, caddisflies or other species that were very sensitive to
Mhm.
water pollution, you would know that the water was good. If it was
Mhm.
only things like mosquito larvae and water boatmen because they're kinda air breathing,
Mhm.
species, that's why mosquitoes have their little butt up to the top of the
Mhm.
water, as larvae, then you knew that the water quality was not as great because it was killing off those other species. But if you
Mhm.
don't get rid of the source of pollution,
Mhm.
eventually it's gonna kill off everything in the
Yeah.
pond, right? And
Mhm.
so we would call those species that were more sensitive to the pollution in the water our indicator species. And I feel like are people of color,
Mhm.
trans folks, people with
Mhm.
disabilities,
Mhm.
all of these, they're our indicator species,
Yeah.
right? When we
Yeah.
think about the environment, like
Mhm.
the people who are most impacted and that are dying because of things like lung cancer, increased
Mhm.
heart disease, increased stroke because of the air pollution,
Yeah.
right? They're just indicating what is to come for
For
you.
everybody.
And you might have said not in your backyard, but eventually it's
Yeah.
gonna come to you, right? So
Yeah. It's one planet, one people with all kinds of history of separation that you're doing great work. We're all doing our part to dismantle. And do you feel hopeful at this moment? What do you how do you feel right now with all that's going on? Do you feel
I feel
heavy?
I feel heavy, but I also feel I have to feel hopeful. I don't think of myself as a person or haven't thought of myself as a person who had really big emotional swings, right?
Mhm.
But the beginning of last year and end of 2024 was very difficult for me. We had the election
Mhm.
and I kinda knew what was coming and trying to prepare for that and losing my contracts and things because I had contracts with, like, National Park Service and, like,
Right.
those
Mhm.
contracts got cut off, like, the day after inauguration. My father died a few days
Mhm.
before Christmas. I got into January, lost a bunch of my contracts, and was trying to figure out what were my next steps, and I ended up going to therapy
Mhm.
because I started to lose hope. I started to feel more hopeless than I'd ever had in my life, and I am generally a positive person, so that was very difficult, and I was like, "I need help, I need something."
Mhm.
And so I went to therapy. I got, some medication. I'm just gonna say that because
Mhm.
I think that there's a stigma to it. Um, so I think it's important to talk about people do what they need. And with that, and with thinking through and spending time just like really trying to think about myself and my community, I came back around to hope because
Mhm.
it's very difficult times that we're in, but I'm seeing community stepping up in a way that
Mhm.
is really heartening. I also started looking at futurist thinking, and it's really interesting because around futurist theory and futurist thinking, there's so many different tools, things like signal scanning, where you kind of look to see what are we being told, like what are the signals
Mhm.
as to where we're headed. And we're
Mhm.
getting like a lot of signals that we're headed right back to 1835. Like, you know,
Mhm.
go right back. They're like, these are all the signals. However, we can look at those signals and say, where is it that they probably want us to go? And then another tool is about imagining multiple futures, kind of like
Mhm.
the multiverse. And
Mhm.
one
Mhm.
future is the future that would happen if we don't do anything. If we just let everything happen, like where are we headed? What is the future if we don't do anything? And then it also encourages you to think about what is like the wildest future,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And then there's like, what if like, what is the future I want to imagine? Like, I
Mhm.
know I can see the future they wanna imagine. What is the future I wanna imagine? And what
Mhm.
are the signals saying that we can get to that future? If I'm imagining a future based in community care and in love and in people being able to be their full selves and people having empathy and all of these things, what are signals that I'm seeing? Because we're so focused, right? We get focused on the signals that are so scary to us, but
Yeah.
there's other signals out there. So, what are those signals? And then, what are the things that we need to do to get to the future that we want?
Mhm.
Because it's like we're on a train and they're like, one way back here,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
we're looking, we have to say, okay, here's one horizon but there's multiple different ones,
Yeah.
and if we can flip a switch, if we can get
Mhm.
this train to, like, run out of coal, if we can,
Mhm.
like if we
Mhm.
can, like, get it on a different like, let's work towards the future that
Yeah.
we want, and I think that is what gives me hope
Mhm.
that I am going to keep working towards the future that I know that we need and that I want because I don't just wanna stay along for the ride that they have. And, I think another thing that gives me hope is something that someone told me before even all of these our most recent events, before we got on the worst timeline.
This train.
And that was that, because I had periods in the beginning where I felt disheartened because I was like, "I am ready." Like, people been fighting. I'm ready for the kumbaya. Like, I'm ready for, like, this space of, like, completeness, of love, of
Mhm.
accepted, everyone accepted. We're, like, doing this thing together and it doesn't seem like we're ever going to get there. And why am I even doing this work if it's not gonna work? And what they told me was that I had to stop thinking about it as like a sprint, not even like a marathon.
Mhm.
That really what it is a generations old relay race. And that we had ancestors that came before us that
Mhm.
fought these battles,
Mhm.
both of us. Like,
Yeah.
I think we don't talk enough about white abolitionists,
Yeah.
right? Like, I think that's a story they really wanna bury,
Mhm.
like, just like the people that we saw
Mhm.
standing in solidarity, getting
Mhm.
killed
Yeah.
with the black and brown people getting killed, like,
Mhm.
that's always been there, so we've had ancestors doing this work for a
Yeah.
long time, and they passed the baton to us,
Yeah.
and we may never see the end. It's not may not be my leg of the race to see the end of the race, right?
Yeah.
But my job is to run the fastest that I can and the hardest that I can in my leg so that
Yeah.
the generation coming after me is
Yeah.
that much closer to the finish line,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that gives me hope because when I think about am I gonna am I gonna get to see that? That can seem hopeless. But when I
Mhm.
think about like It is my job to do what ancestors did that came before me and
Yeah.
just, like, keep moving because
Yeah.
one day it'll come. Then that gives me hope and the energy to keep going.
Yeah. Amen. Beautiful. Well, I'm in it with you, Parker, as so
Yeah.
many others are, and thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for coming in May to help our community to grow in our consciousness of how we can do a better job. I'll put all that info in the show notes, and so many blessings on your journey in all that you're carrying and doing.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so
Mhm.
much for having me here today.
You're very welcome.
And I love it when we both are in